Hello and welcome to the Yale Center for British Art's online programme, Isaac Julien and the Museum, which has been organised in support of our current exhibition, Isaac Julien, Lina Bo Bardi, A Marvellous Entanglement, on view at the Yale School of Architecture through December 10, 2023. I'm Rachel Stratton, Postdoctoral Research Associate at the Yale Center for British Art and co-curator of the exhibition. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Giuliana Bruno of Harvard University and Thom Collins, Director and President of the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, both of whom I will introduce more fully momentarily. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this program will be recorded and your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We'll be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Giuliana and Thom, and they'll be answered at the end of the program. But please do just put your questions in, submit questions at any time during the program. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Skyaticoke, Golden Hill Palgasset, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. And now on to our panel discussion today. Dating back to the early 1990s, Isaac Julien has been making films and installations that engage with the ways that collectors, collections, and museum spaces have shaped histories and structured culture. Throughout much of his work is an acute sensitivity to the unconscious drives that govern collecting practices and museum display, and the systems of desire, violence, and erasure on which they're built. Lina Bo Bardi, A Marvellous Entanglement, the piece on view at Yale, engages with these ideas through Bo Bardi's transgressive curatorial practices. And our discussion today will take this as the starting point to think through Julien's critical engagement with museums and collections and their functions within what Bo Bardi described as a social ecology. And we could not have asked for two people better placed to have this conversation than our panelists today, Giuliana Bruno and Thom Collins, both of whom have been engaging and supporting Julien's work for many years and bring to this topic a deep and very distinct, I might add, expertise. Giuliana Bruno is Emmet Blakeney Gleason Professor of Visual and Environmental Studies at Harvard University. Internationally known for interdisciplinary research on visual arts, architecture, and media, she has published 7 award-winning books and over 100 essays. Her latest book is Atmospheres of Projection, Environmentality in Art and Screen Media, Chicago 2022. Atlas of Emotion, Journeys in Art, Architecture, and Film, Verso 2002, has provided new directions for visual studies and won the Krasner-Krauss Prize for the Best Moving Image Book. Her other books include Street Walking on a Ruined Map, Princeton 1993, winner of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Book Award, Public Intimacy, Architecture and the Visual Arts, MIT 2007, and Surface, Matters of Aesthetics, Materiality, and Media, Chicago 2014. Professor Bruno has written on art and architecture, among others, for the Guggenheim Museum, the Venice Biennale, the Museo Reina Sofia, the Whitney Museum, and the Museum of Modern Art. She has written extensively on Isaac Julien's work, including for the brochure accompanying our exhibition at Yale, and is also working with Julien on a larger publication about this work, Lina Bo Bardi, A Marvellous Entanglement. Thom Collins is the Neubauer and Family Executive Director and President of the Barnes Foundation. An innovative educator and accomplished art historian, administrator, and author, Thom Collins, a Philadelphia native, has more than 20 years of experience at some of America's top arts institutions, including the Perez Art Museum, Miami, the Neubauer Museum of Art in Purchase, New York, the Contemporary Museum in Baltimore, the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Collins earned his MA in art history from Northwestern University and his BA with honors in art history and the history of religion from Swarthmore College. He serves on the board of trustees at Swarthmore College and is a member of the Association of Art Museum Directors, the Association of Art Museum Curators, and the College Art Association. So please unmute yourselves and welcome. And we're going to begin with a kind of quite broad question, which is, what do you think the museum is to Isaac Julien? And I'll turn to Giuliana first.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and for the wonderful introduction and for this invitation. And I am delighted to be having this conversation with Thom, who has had also a lot of connections with Isaac from Baltimore all the way to, once again, Statues Never Die. And I also, if you allow me, I would like to also, for full disclosure, say that my husband, Andrew Fearberg, produced both of these works. And so I want to acknowledge him and thank him for the knowledge I've learned behind the scenes, so to speak, though my lips are synced on a lot of these aspects. This is, a fabulous question, which I'm sure we will articulate through the specific of the way in which Isaac has engaged the museum in each one of the works that we'll be talking about today. But I think one thing that all of them have in common, from the Attendant to Baltimore to Vagabondia to Statues Never Die, once again, Statues Never Die, to Lina Bo Bardi and Marvellous Entanglement, is that the museum is not just an object of representation in Isaac's work. It is actually the engine, the drive of the work itself. And it's an engine that moves Isaac's investigation on the nature of culture and cultural memory and how it is accumulated, how it is displayed, how it arises, how it is suppressed, how it circulates, and also how it can be reinvented. So it's a political and aesthetic investigation and a cultural investigation. And all three elements, I think, go together in his attempt to work through these issues and at the same time not only exhibit what the museum is, but the importance of this place as an archive that can be mined politically and artistically to create a different kind of vision and different form of representation. And I think he's interested in this not only as a subject that drives investigation, but also in the way in which he installs the installations as well, the way in which he deals with the architecture of the museum in all senses, the internal architectonics as well as the display. And that is something that we'll discuss more in the specific of each one of the works. And it's that sense of display and that sense of design in the largest sense of the museum that allows him also to create a different vision, which he has called a kind of creolization of the museum. That is a way to generate a different outlook on it by investigating the way in which the museum as an institution has come together, but also how it can be thwarted from within. And creolization for him is an interrelation. So it's something that has to do with displacements. He displaces, figures, bodies in the Western museums, different kinds of bodies, Black bodies, different gazes, different ways of activating it with music, with sound, and all of that. It creates a kind of diffraction, but also a way in which the displacement is felt as a possibility to create a hybrid vision or a different kind of vision. And so to me, in that respect, it's something that's very close to a poetics of interrelationality that reminds me of Edouard Glissant's Poetics of Relation, or also the kind of rooted errancy. There's a kind of the vagabonds that move around, the Vagabondia of Isaac, and by these forms of displacement, he's able, in the space itself, to redesign a kind of installation of the museum in his own particular way.
So, as Giuliana alludes, it is a multifarious, complex practice. And I think about answering this question at first, I was thinking about it very schematically as a way to sort of bring the same frame of reference to the different works we'll discuss today. And in answering the question, what is a museum for Isaac Julien? I think first, really two dimensions. This one is mnemonic. The museum is mnemonic for him. It is a mnemonic. It's a stimulus, an aid to memory, and this is something that Giuliana has actually written about, I think, quite compellingly. But it's also a heterotopic, which is to say, it pertains to the cultural, institutional, and discursive spaces, which are ideas and experience, which offer ideas and experiences that pose alternatives to really existing conditions in the world that contain them, which is to say that museums for him are at once retrospective and also prospective. They can prompt thinking about a critical rethinking of the histories they embody and represent, while also prompting critical consideration of an action toward different futures, other futures, as the heterotopia implies. And he mobilizes these aspects of the museum in the piece that we produced in a very interesting way, in service to what he refers to as a project of poetic restitution. And I think we'll talk about the idea of poetic restitution when we speak about the recent piece that he produced for the Barnes Foundation. But that's how I think about it, kind of schematically entering the conversation.
That's a really good place to kind of delve into Lina Bo Bardi and Marvellous Entanglement. So we'll look at a clip, but and then just I'll ask the question now. A lot of what you were saying really also relates to how Bo Bardi thought about curating this idea of the retrospective and the prospective. And so I wonder, particularly for you, Giuliana, given that you've written so extensively on this topic, if you could talk a bit after the clip about what it was that drew Isaac to Bo Bardi's practice and the affinities you see in his filmmaking practice with her curatorial practice. Just to say, the sound on this is very quiet, unfortunately.
Fabulous clip that I think speaks for itself. So let me start from here. You know, what the museum, in a sense, is an archive to be recreated. So an archive that is not nostalgic, mnemonic in a sense it's nostalgic, but something that actually generates a different form of circulation of knowledge and cultural memory. And in particular, in this museum, which is the Maspi Museum that Lina Bo Bardi designed, and where she designed this fantastic installation, this really comes alive. Lina Bo Bardi was a visionary 20th century Italo-Brazilian architect who architected not only museums, but also designed exhibition spaces. And this is a particularly important point in this installation and in the entanglement of desires between Isaac and Lina. She also designed furniture, costumes, jewelry. So she was a kind of a character that Isaac attached to. And he was particularly enthralled when he saw this particular image, which is the installation of an original design for the Maspi Museum main gallery room that Lina Bo Bardi had done and that opened to the public in 1969. The installation that she designed had then been destroyed and walls were built. And in 2015, it was reinstated. And Isaac, I think, was completely taken with this. And how could not one be taken by it? I mean, think about in 1969, right, entering for the first time this museum space that had not only glass all around, but no walls and no paintings ever hanging on the walls. The paintings were over 100 paintings were in front of your eyes all together, hovering in space, suspended in space, positioned on something that Bo Bardi called crystal easels. And this is a very interesting definition because in a sense, it reminded you that you were seeing painting as if you were seeing them in an artist studio when an artist would put a painting on an easel. She had constructed this crystal easel, designed them herself with the glass that you see here and mounted on cement, and then decided in some way to create a kind of cinematic exhibition where the paintings would not be looked at linearly or singularly, but they would be looked at in association, in montage, so to speak, you know, one next to each other, and also in sequence, right? So in a sense, this was already kind of a cinema for Isaac to mine, because what you saw was non-linear, and it was associative, and it was in movement, all aspects that are, you know, part of cinema. And this revolutionized museum space because you could make associations that were non-canonical this way, right? You would see everything all together as in a bird's eye view, and you could put paintings one next to each other that didn't belong to the same author, to the same period, to the same nation, to the same kind of philological idea of a traditional museum. So Isaac was very, very drawn to this kind of display and to this architectonics. And what he first decided to do was absolutely brilliant, which is to remake the crystal easels. So he actually designed a way to install his screens on a cement base, substituting the glass of the paint that the paintings are standing on for screens. And in this way, he also made a transposition, you know, between canvas, glass, and screen, because of course the glass is reflective and refractive. And what is a screen if not a fabric of light, you know, that reflects and refracts? And so in the installation that if you haven't seen it, you should see it at the Yale Architecture Gallery. What you see is screens that are positioned on this cement base, and through which you see in movement. So there is also a kind of other, you know, cinematic aspect to this that has to do with the fact that you can move through it, right? That you're not that, and you can move through it in your own accord, and you are also you're also taken by sound in a way in which you move through the screens. So the filmic technique, which is using montage of screens, recalls Bo Bardi's idea of this associative montage of painting. The tracking shot, as you can see through the museum, is a kind of spectatorial movement that mobilizes the museum, that makes it into a moving space itself, not something static in time. And last but not least, I think there is another aspect of this architectural, in a sense, display that is interesting to Isaac. And unlike other artists, he works with the space in which the piece is installed. So when I first saw this piece, that when it was shown at the Maxi Museum in Rome during the pandemic, I snuck in. I was one of the few people who actually saw it. That, you know, is an architecture of Zaha Hadid. And it's an interesting museum and a difficult one to install space. And so Isaac's was installed in a space that was adjacent to a ramp, but the ramp was used. So this movement became the movement of the architecture of the ramp, and one of the screens was visible on both sides as you walked in. So you had that sense of mobilization of museum space actually actualized in that. When it was shown at the Philadelphia Art Museum, it was in dialogue with Frank Gehry's architecture, and especially the staircase. And when it is shown now at the Yale Architecture Gallery, there's something else that happens that's interesting. I mean, Bo Bardi was a modernist, right? And a modernist who reinvented modernism in Brazilian way, after having worked with Joe Ponti and having absorbed the kind of movement of exhibition design of Franco Albini. And when she moved to Brazil, all of that kind of, oral creolization happened in these connections of different cultures that created a hybrid. And so in her version of modernism, she uses concrete, of course, not just in these the stands for the crystal easels. And when you walk into the architecture gallery at Yale, what happens is that you see the Paul Rudolph, undulating concrete, and it dialogues with Bo Bardi's undulated concrete. So there is this kind of intertextuality becomes a kind of intertexturality in which, the spaces become kind of fused together. And in the image that you first showed, in the Museum of, when she remade a kind of very old-fashioned old building into a museum of art in Bahia, she liberated the rooms and only the staircase appears. And Isaac made use of the staircase, by creating a kind of folding, undulating motion as it is activated by a dance that in a sense activates the dance of the museum, the way in which the museum itself becomes a choreography of movements of memory, of movements of images, of images that in that movement create a different kind of space. So I think that's one of the cracks of the way in which he works with this marvelous entanglement in some way between architecture and moving image, which is kind of a personal entanglement between him and Lina, who shared, I think, really a vision, or at least, and Isaac kind of discovered an elective affinity, I think, when he encountered this incredible architect whose work is now celebrated, but that for a while was actually kind of set aside in the canon of modernism and architecture.
Giuliana, in your introductory remarks, you used two terms that I think might be usefully unpacked with regard to this particular piece. The first, of course, is the concept of nonlinear time, and the second is the idea of creolization.
The nonlinear time comes from Lina Bo Bardi. She was a writer too, and an editor. Actually, one of the aspects of her work that I am completely fascinated by, and lucky that that I'm Italian, so I can actually peruse all of her writings, all over the ones that she also wrote for women's magazines, that are kind of lesser known. And in one of her writings, she said, linear time is a Western invention. Time is non-linear. And at any point, things can be changed and happen and start and move. And so there is a kind of, unfolding of time that I think connects together the two of them, and the way in which this cultural memory, does not have to fold linearly in space, in the space of the museum itself, where you have to look at a wall and move linearly from one to the other, but also it moves in some way non-linearly also in terms of the way in which different kinds of cultures can create hybrid movements and hybrid connections among themselves, the way in which cultures can unfold together. And that, I think, relates to this idea of creolizing the museum that, that Isaac that Isaac speaks about, starting with Vagabondia. So it's not a recent trend. I mean, Vagabondia was made in 2000, so 23 years ago. He talked about this, and I mean, Isaac his family comes from the island of St. Lucia, the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. He was British born black artist, but the tradition is important to him. And in Vagabondia, you use the Creole language in a sense to remake the architecture of the museum, which was very much an enlightened architecture, meaning an architecture of enlightenment, and transforming it, you know, in this particular way by using the voiceover in Creole that is spoken actually by his mother. And but for him, this Creolization is not just a process of decolonizing. It's something deeper, because, as you know, Thom, you were also saying, the mnemonic is a kind of proactive. It goes backwards but forwards. I mean, Isaac is interested in recreating that memory, not just in just, you know, deconstructing it and critiquing it. His critique is generative, and one of the way in which it generates something else is closer to this idea of a poetic of relations, because Creolization for him defines the mixed languages, the creative registers, you know, that can happen when these mixed languages are associated together, in the way in which, you know, in this picture you see Bo Bardi making associations that are non-canonical and creating something else out of it. So by creating also geographic transpositions, by displacements, but displacements that are physical, right? Putting a Black conservator that walks through, you know, Sir John Soane's museum, or but transpositions that are also hybrid mental states. And this is important because it's a form of imagination here. Hybrid mental states that arise when one inhabits and traverses multiple cultures. So, you know, Isaac in some way is a product of this hybrid transposition, and that's that particular gaze and that particular point of view he has, you know, worked through also by creolizing the museum, enhancing this particular aspect of what can happen in this poetics of relationality, of interrelationality between all of these aspects.
I think that's a really great point at which to move on to his most recent work, once again, Statues Never Die, because it is, once again, as is so often the case with Julian's work, it is about this coming together of two different cultures and how they have, you know, been placed together and shown together and collected together. It is, well, I will let Thom talk more about it after the clip, but I wanted to just pick up on a kind of a thread from this idea of nonlinearity that clearly drew, you know, Isaac to Lina Bo Bardi, and think about this in also a kind of nonlinear way, in that it's dialogic. It is a conversation. So we'll watch the clip, and then Thom, it would be great if you could talk a little bit, returning to this idea of poetic restitution and how that operates in this film.
The significance of African art is incontestable. At this stage, it needs no apologia. Indeed, no genuine art ever does. Having passed, however, through a period of neglect and disesteem, during which it was regarded as if crude, bizarre, and primitive, African art is now in danger of another sort of misconstruction, that of being taken up as an exotic fad and a fashionable amateurish interest.
I don't even know where to start with this one. I will offer you the genesis of the project. The Barnes celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2022, And we approached Isaac about producing a piece on the occasion of that anniversary. And his starting point was an obvious one. We didn't focus his attention. He very quickly settled upon the idea of exploring the relationship, the very generative relationship between Dr. Barnes and Alain Locke, whom, if you know, many refer to as the father of the Harlem Renaissance. They had a very interesting, complex, and generative relationship in the early 1920s. And the story goes on. And if you're interested, it's well documented in Jeffrey Stewart's Pulitzer Prize winning biography, which is approximately 1,000 pages long, of Alain Locke, called The New Negro. But I'll give you the quick talking points. In the early 1920s, Dr. Barnes was collecting not only the work for which he's best known, which is, of course, European modernism, late 19th and early 20th centuries, but he was also collecting, with the assistance of Paul Guillaume, the dealer who helped him assemble his collection of modernist paintings. He was also collecting African art and material culture. And he was collecting this work really in service to a very personal and particular argument, which I'm going to leave aside for the moment because it's rather complex, has to do with American pragmatism and so forth, and his own educational project, as inspired by the philosopher, educational theorist John Dewey. But it was difficult perhaps now to believe that in 1923-24, the years in which he first came to know Alain Locke, it was one of the very few places, the Barnes Foundation, where one can actually experience African art and material culture in a substantial way in the United States, Newark, Brooklyn being a couple of others. Dr. Barnes was collecting this work in service to an argument about a kind of universal impulse with regard to the persuasive power of formal decision-making in artistic production, design, and visual arts. And he was, of course, very cognizant of the fact that many of the artists that he collected, in particular artists like Modigliani and Picasso and so forth, were of course very much influenced by various dimensions of African material culture. And if you know the Barnes collection well, you will know that it's installed in a very unusual way, which is to say that it is installed with no didactic materials, in groups of pictures and objects organized by Dr. Barnes as teaching tools in a project of creating a kind of self-awareness, promoting self-awareness through self-reflection inspired by close-looking activities, extended close looking. What's interesting, particularly early in this clip, you saw Danny Houston, the actor portraying Dr. Barnes, walking through one of two galleries in which Dr. Barnes very carefully juxtaposes African objects with European modernist paintings. And it is a unique moment in his installation because it's the only place where he really is making any kind of an argument about influence, about borrowing, about cultural translation and so forth. Otherwise, this doesn't happen. But he did it both in service to an argument about this kind of notion that these impulses were universal, that one could identify universal impulses in making. It was also in service to what was then for him a nascent project of social engagement and social support for what would be called the early civil rights movement in the United States, his engagement with African-American communities in and around Philadelphia. Locke was introduced to him, or they were introduced to one another by Paul Guillaume. Of course, Locke, traveling frequently in Europe after his time as the first African-American Rhodes Scholar, encountered Guillaume in Paris, was introduced to Barnes. And he was, of course, interested in Barnes because he was very interested in what he might make of African material culture as source material and so forth for the project that he was framing, which has later been referred to as the Harlem Renaissance. And so he was very interested in seeing this material. He was also interested in, of course, Barnes supporting his various publications projects and so forth. So he approached Barnes first. Barnes recognized in Locke someone who could be a thought partner. And even though they had very different points of approach to this project, Barnes was nonetheless very supportive of Alain Locke's project. and supported publications, and in fact was the only non-Black contributor to the volume that was called The New Negro, that was published in 1925 and edited by Alain Locke. So that was the entry point for Isaac, was exploring this relationship. Of course, it opened all kinds of other avenues of study, including an exploration of the implications of conversations about the repatriation of cultural materials. The Barnes has one object, really only one object that's a focus in that conversation for us, which is a really fantastic Benin bronze that was front and center in all the documentary photographs that precede the British Expeditionary Force raid on and destruction of the Benin Palace in 1897. We are very much in the process of exploring exactly how that object could be repatriated and to whom and so forth, and those complex issues aside for a moment. But Isaac really more interested both in what these objects meant to Locke and what the way in which Locke translated his ideas for a larger public, the way they might galvanize the cultural producers of the Harlem Renaissance on the one hand, and very interested in, of course, the way in which they're experienced now in the context of this largely European modernist collection. I just wanted to offer two quotes. These are actually from Locke's writing about this material that appear as voiceover later in this installation. The first, Locke says, and of course this is articulated by the character, by the actor Andre Holland, who's playing Locke in this video. Locke wrote, "If by nothing more mystical than the sense of being ethnically related, some of us will feel its influence as keenly as those who have already made it recognized and famous, nothing is more galvanizing than the sense of a cultural past." He was looking for a cultural unifying platform for that stood in contrast to the sociological and more explicitly political activism of African-American thinkers and organizers in the period. He also wrote, "Since African art has had such a vitalizing influence in modern European painting, sculpture, poetry, and music, it becomes finally a natural and important question as to what artistic and cultural effect it can or will have upon the life of the American Negro." Again, a very specific point of entry into this conversation, and in a way very different than Barnes' own posture around this material. Nonetheless, this was the point of the exploration, and in this piece, Isaac, the piece folds in on itself and in on itself in terms of its narrative, and then opens up and opens up and opens up back toward the end of the piece in perhaps one of the most easily diagrammed of Isaac's script in terms of the way in which he manipulates time and narrative. So the piece really plays through all of these ideas. It also again, opens on the question of the Benin raid or the raid on the kingdom of Benin and the destruction of the kingdom of Benin. And it's I think it's very important to note that much of the voiceover, again, we have multiple juxtapositions here, and I would love to hear Giuliana talk about the one that's represented here, which is Isaac has recreated a character that appears in the 1953 Chris Marker film, Statues Also Die, which was at that time a very controversial film, in which a character here, represented in the lower left of your screen, reenacted walking through the Pitt Rivers Museum, the Pitt Rivers collection of what was called ethnological material at that time, a collection that Alain Locke encountered and spent quite a good deal of time in as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and this is an explicit reference to the Chris Marker film. This woman is actually clothed as that character, who in the original film is exploring the contents of ethnological collections in Paris in the 1950s. I'll offer one quote as a context to this, and I'm very interested in hearing Giuliana's response to all of this, because this could go on all day. But the voiceover to the touring piece from the Pitt Rivers collection, as opposed to the lock texts that provide the voiceover for the visit to the Barnes collection, is I think, very powerful, and it's drawn directly from the writing of Aimé Césaire in his famous discourse on colonialism, published in 1950. Martinican poet, philosopher, and political activist, who really was the progenitor of the Francophone Negritude movement. The voiceover that accompanies the Pitt Rivers tour, and then I promise I'll stop, but it's very important here, is as follows. And what of the museums of which Europe is so proud, it reads, it would have been better, all things considered, if it had never been necessary to open them. Better if the Europeans had allowed the civilizations beyond the continent of Europe to live alongside them, dynamic and prosperous, whole and unmutilated. Better if they had let those civilizations develop and flourish rather than offering up scattered limbs, these dead limbs duly labeled for us to admire. Here in the museum, the rapture of self-gratification rots our eyes. A secret contempt of others dries up our hearts. Racism, no matter if it is declared or undeclared, drains all empathy away. No, in the scales of knowledge, the mass of all the museums in the world could never outweigh a lone spark of human empathy. Julia.
It's a wonderful, wonderful quote that sums up, I think, Isaac's point of view and on this matter. And I have to say, Thom, it was a brilliant idea for you to commission this piece to Isaac, because for the 100th anniversary, you couldn't have thought of somebody else that could have done such an incredible job at exposing all of these complex issues, and at the same time, generating, making a new way. And since we are about quoting in this, I would say that, what Isaac is also doing is using these in his research, all of these pieces of writing to speak his words, but to also speak the words as they were. I mean, he does that with Lina Bo Bardi, where the two actresses who impersonate her speak the words from her writings, and he does it also here, as you well said. And among them, there is another voice that I think plays an important part in talking about this question of generating a different outlook, how to make it so that analyzing all the violence that is there in these, in acquiring these objects, can avoid being draining the possibilities of having another outlook or a generative look that actually makes something out of this archive. And he does that by using Alan Locke, his figure, his body, and his writings, the way in which he, as you said, related to and made something out of this juxtaposition and association between Western paintings and African art, but also by incorporating writings by his very good friend Bell Hooks, who wrote not only about violence but wrote about empathy, and wrote about the possibilities of overcoming this in different ways. And there's a wonderful quote from Bell, where in a moment when you see the snow on Alan Locke and the snow covering the landscape, where she says, "Through the snowy cold, everything stopped. I have left time behind. We surrendered the solidness of our body to become snowflakes, present and then dissolving. We're able to shell all the other pieces of our identities that bind and imprison us. As we mature as artists in the mystical diasporic dream space, a culture of infinite possibilities is ready to receive us. This is artistic freedom, as pure and unsullied as falling snow." Yes. And this is a piece that Bell wrote for Isaac, actually, and where she's talking about making a new way, which is actually also the text of this amazing song by Alice Smith that that pervades the installation, and where she's actually, you know, in a contemporary way, so looking at this past, but also looking forward as what can be made of this archive, how can this archive generate a different outlook, and I mean, it gives me actually the goosebumps, and it moves me every time I hear it say it. And also the installation itself, you know, had contemporary outlook on African art. The statues of Matthew Harrison that take African material objects and encase them in plexiglass, which actually, you know, they're translucent as the translucent crystal easels of Lina Bo Bardi, and they transform the objects themselves, and they are surrounding the installation together with mirrors. So this is kind of, you know, a sense of resonance and reverberation and attitude in being able to make something out of these hybrid spaces that is, I think, very important to Isaac.
Yes, very, very much so. I mean, I think this idea of the mystical diasporic dream space is precisely the heterotopic impulse encapsulated in this project. This is a great story, but I think it's very interesting and illustrative of Isaac's associative process to making these very complex, creating these very complex narratives, and that is that piece, that text was adduced as voiceover to close the film, and it was made on the site of the old Barnes Foundation, building Dr. Barnes' home in Marion, Pennsylvania, on the one day it snowed during the entire process of filming this piece. And so it was really quite accidental, couldn't have been predicted. And Isaac made a beautiful, beautiful passage in this piece, and then was able to adduce this particular text as a way to sort of, you know, create a kind of resonance at the end of this film. It is the only film installation I've ever been in where people are predictably crying at the end of the piece. It is truly a remarkable piece. Of course, also the emotion is very much about his relationship with Bell Hooks, which, as you point out, was very intimate.
I wonder if we could pick up some of the ideas that have come out from talking about, once again, Statues Never Die, and actually in Marvellous Entanglement, in thinking about Vagabondia, which is a much earlier work from 2000. So we're jumping way back in his career. But I think there are kernels of both Lina Bo Bardi and Marvellous Entanglement, and once again, Statues Never Die in Vagabondia, not least in a kind of literal sense, in that Sir John Soane was an architect. And he was also a collector who set up a house museum, as did Barnes. And so some of the kind of origins of these ideas that are explored so fully in the works we've talked about happen in Vagabondia. So let's watch the clip, and then I won't ask a question, but I'm just going to open it to perhaps, well, either one of you, whoever wants to go first can go first, to talk about your thoughts on this film.
Look at Place la drôle.
Regardez ça.
Place la tellement drôle.
Tellement drôle.
Place la pleine d'histoire. About hier. Hier, personne qui a fait ça changer le présent. Alors, nous, ça. Éduquer, et puis apprendre plus bien.
Well, I mean, you sort of experience here, you know, physically, I mean, a few of the aspects that we've been talking about. The creolizing with the voiceover, you know, being this hybrid of African, Caribbean, and French, you know, spoken by Isaac's mother, and as well as this kind of time, being non-linear, the sort of folding of the image, the folding of times. And there are, Rachel, you're right, these very interesting lines of connection in the way in which Isaac thinks about the museum. And here, for the first time, he engages a house museum, as he did with the Alfred Barnes Horn House Museum, and also engages a museum of that was built by an architect, like Lina Bo Bardi is an architect. So you have this line of connection. And again, because Isaac is actually looking at the architectonics of the museum in the way in which the museum itself displays and circulates and imagines and produces culture, even in its design, in the larger sense. Here, it's a different idea. So here is the Enlightenment. This is an enlightened vision of the museum. He uses the kind of visual enchantment that Sir John Soane had employed in his own way of collecting, which was and putting the objects together, which was very different from Alfred Barnes. And so he never repeats, or very different from Lina Bo Bardi. He goes deeply into the way in which a collection is assembled, designed, displayed. And here the design, the display reflects actually on the collection itself, on its design, with a sense of wandering delight. So using optical devices that both reveal and distort the view, which were very present in Enlightenment and in the enlightened way of creating a museum, using mirrors that reflect and refract, and doubling the images as mirrors do. So here you have this extraordinarily interesting thing where the two screens, unlike many artists who just, put them together and maybe make some connection between them, Isaac is folding them together. He's actually enacting this idea of the folds of time being nonlinear, by folding the two screens together as bodies would fold into one another. And we saw it in this, in this beautiful clip. So the folding of the objects, in a sense, is something that also relates and works with one of Sir John Soane's own devices for displaying the collection. And this is also interesting because it really means a kind of, deep research into the spatial visual culture of display that actually creates in and in itself a form of knowledge. So not just what the objects are, but how the objects are relating to each other, and what those relations, if investigated the way he does by unfolding them in his own way, could generate for the future. And so Sir John Soane had if you've been to the museum, there's objects everywhere, kind of like statues all over the place, the mirrors that connect them together, distort them. So Isaac used all of that. But in particular, one device, which is, he devised a kind of cabinet of curiosities type, a cabinet that had on every pane a painting, and you could open it up as you open the pages of a book. And so the paintings would be displayed in this way. So the fold of a page, the fold of a book, the unfolding of time became this kind of strategy of folding the two screens together to generate a different kind of image. And then, of course, there is the spatial sonic aspect, which is also important in all of the installations that we have talked about, that animates this museum, as well as it animates the space of the Lina Bo Bardi museum, because he had not only the Black Conservator move through the collection as distant voices were activated by different kinds of choreographies of movement. So a kind of a beat that moves this unfolding, as well as a dancer that actually reimagined with his own body the space of the museum. So again, this kind of mobilizing the space that you see in the Lina Bo Bardi museum is something that generated about 20 some years before in this particular museum.
Mm-hmm. And you point something very interesting, which is that this is the Wunderkammer in the expanded field, right? And it is And of course, all of these materials were gathered during sort of the grand tour. So it represents a different kind of aspiration, certainly, than the aspiration that drove Barnes collecting, for example. But yeah, I mean, insofar, Julian, as everything I know and think about this particular piece, I filter through what I've read that you've written about it. I'm very interested to know what you think about the aspiration represented here.
Well, should we continue on this, or should we move into the Baltimore? What do you think, Rachel?
So we are very nearly at time, and I know, Thom, that you have to catch a train. So why don't we move into Baltimore, and maybe Giuliana, you can kind of.
Then I can kind of fold them together.
Fold it in, exactly.
How about it?
Okay. So I wonder if you could, so this is a film that brings together 3 museums in Baltimore, the Walters Art Museum, the Contemporary Art Museum, and the Great Blacks in Wax Museum. I know that both of you know both this piece and Baltimore more widely quite well. So I wonder if you could maybe talk about this piece in relationship to the politics of viewership that is drawn out in it.
Should I?
Please.
Go ahead. There's also another institution there, which is the 19th century George Peabody Library. So that appears at some point. And I think it's important just because libraries are also archives, right, of cultural memory. And so this is a piece that, in a sense, most clearly, I think, responds to Thom's idea that the mnemonic is also something futuristic. And that's how that happens. At that time, Isaac, this was made in 2003, so a few years after Vagabondia, that was 2000. At that time, Isaac was interested in Black's exploitation film genre. And he actually had made a documentary about this called Badass Cinema in 2002, while he was also reflecting on the museum as a kind of cultural space and how it deals with Black culture. And so here what you have is that you, on 3 screens, right, you move through these different spaces, not just the museum, but the space of the city of Baltimore. And Baltimore, the eerie, empty, gritty streets of Baltimore become even more eerie. And Isaac kind of makes it into a sort of futuristic space by using also one of the paintings of the ideal city. So mixing again, folding together the great Renaissance vision of the empty city, of the ideal city, with the gritty states of one of American city. But what he does is that he makes it into a kind of science fiction place too. So it's eerie, it's empty, but it's also futuristic, and it's also noirish because it's all pervaded by the guns, of Black's exploitation film. And Thom and I were saying, and we're not sure Isaac will agree with this, that the film is a kind of early example of Afrofuturism, because in a way this he's kind of turning all this into this sort of vision of the future by again, working with what's there, but also generating something different, something for the future. And the museum is also, as a mnemonic space, is involved in this idea of looking forward, because what it does is that we enter into this, in the Walter Arts Museum that collects the great European paintings, but you also, discover this incredible place, a Great Blacks in Wax Museum, which I had actually wax figures of all the Great Blacks, and then in his process of displacement or transposition or translation, he had this brilliant idea of taking some of these wax figures, bodies, and displace them and put them in front of the great European masters, looking at them. And by just making this kind of change of bodies and change of spaces, you see everything in a completely different way. And what's also interesting is that we encounter in this movement the great actor, filmmaker, writer, and composer Melvin Van Peebles, who's the one who jump-started the genre of American Black exploitation film with his 1971 film Sweet Sweetback Badass Song, from which Isaac made the badass documentaries. And he's the one who physically moves through these spaces, physically looking at the different kinds of visions. And in the end, in this fabulous shot that you have in front of you here, he confronts his own, body made in wax. Now, this is interesting also because this piece is not only eerie and Afrofuturistic, it's ironic. So there's a certain kind of, lightness and intelligence, spark of intelligence, and clever and irony in all this. I mean, it is kind of poignant and serious, but at the same time, this kind of looking at oneself in wax also brings together a kind of incredible sense of irony. Also, because I should say that Melvin Van Peebles, statue was not in the Great Blacks in Wax Museum. He actually didn't, was not recognized as one, though he obviously is. And so it was Isaac who actually, had the statue in wax being made and made them both confront each other in the guise of the wax model. And it's important that's a wax model too, because the wax models are in a sense the enactment of early stages of the museum, and also a certain kind of, traditionally European museum, Musée Grévin in Paris, the Madame Tussauds, museum. And so here you have already a transposition in the Great Blacks in wax, and then Isaac taking these figures and repositioning them and making them confront the physical body, and also thinking about the wax model in relation to how memory becomes mummified, in the translucent waxed body. And that's also the fate of cinema. In some way, cinema and the Wax Museum were born together, and they were born together with the public museum. It was, in fact, actually some of the early screenings of films happen in the Musée Grévin. So you have here, all of these elements. You have film, you have the history of film, you have the history of the Wax Museum, the history of European paintings. You have music, you have Blacks exploitation, and all of this intersects together to create a completely different vision in this way that displaces things for the future. And I think that's important. It's not a nostalgic outlook at all, what we have seen. And it's not because it's this instantiation, in a sense, of Afrofuturism is a way of thinking about a different future for a different memory, for a different archive.
I can't think of a better final word before we transition into our conversation.
Yes, so why don't I stop the share? We actually, the Q&A, we have very little time. I'm going to say 5 minutes just so that we ensure that Thom does catch his train. If you'd like to post a question in the Q&A box, please do so now. I will start with a question in that case, because there don't seem to be any in there at this moment. You've been too comprehensive in your thoughts. One of the things that is a thread throughout these films is the idea of the portraiture, or another way of looking at it would be a biopic. They all coalesce around an individual figure and their life and how they have thought about collections or museums. Apart from in the Melvin Van Peebles, which is more about, not necessarily about how he thinks about museums, but how he thinks about film. So I wonder what you think the role of the individual and the personality is in the way Julien thinks about the museum.
I mean, clearly Isaac is using biographies, right, to organize these projects, but he has these figures ventriloquizing other figures all the time. I mean, I think it's really remarkable the extent to which his scripts are, bring together multiple voices that are articulated through one individual megaphone. And I don't know how Giuliana thinks about that, but to me, it is the richness and texture of these projects, at least in terms of the spoken text, is a function of that kind of bricolage, that kind of scripting activity.
Yeah, I think that that actually he's using this figure as guides, as almost through not only their own imagination, but through how their imagination of museums in this case, but of culture in general, can generate others. And it's always in dialogue. It's always dialogic. I don't think this is only a biography. It's because it's really it's more about the kind of the way that these figures generated a certain form of cultural production and put it in place and in space that is interesting to him, and not in particular their lives or what they actually did, but more how that stands also for us today. What do we do with this? It's and that's why he always juxtaposes another figure through this. There's always somebody else looking at what these people have done. And in the case of the piece that you commissioned, Thom, it's literally a dialogue between Alfred Barnes and Alan Locke that gets staged, even fictionalized. I mean, he has two actors, impersonating them. That's as close to, in a sense, to a fiction film as you get there. And it is also in the Baltimore piece. It's in a sense the using Melvin Van Peebles as this guide through reimagining how these institutions, these three different institutions, could actually generate a different look. That not being so distant from each other, the great blacks in wax in one place and the European art in others. So there's always this kind of dialogic, in a sense, connection that happens there.
I mean, I don't want to go too far down this road, but there is also a high level of identification. Isaac identifies with very directly with some of these core characters, and so in a sense, they're also speaking his own, his own posture, his own position around these core issues. It's deeply felt. These works are deeply felt.
I think you're right. I mean, not that we want to go in biography, but there's another way of understanding biography that has to do with what sometimes I like to call elective affinities, sort of kind of finding a figure that somehow from the interior you sympathize with, in the Greek sense of the word, sympathos, thinking along the lines, feeling with, thinking along, feeling with. And I think that's certainly the case with Lina Bo Bardi. I mean, it's in the title, A Marvellous Entanglement. What is an entanglement? It's like it's more than a folding together. It's a knotting together. It's a kind of being imbricated deeply into a relationship and not being afraid of it, not being afraid of this deep empathy, this deep sympathy, and that's why that sense of, the quote that you had, Thom, was so important. all of the statues and all the violence cannot take that away, and so through this you feel this connection that comes from within, and at the same time is generated from the outside. It's almost as if these paintings that we have here in the back, these have a kind of seductive, erotic, quality that connects, that speak from themselves, not just the figure, but the vitality of these objects. And so they take him on a journey. And that's certainly the case for Sir John Soane's museum, for that collection. And also I think it happened very much so in the Barnes, and he went looking for it in Baltimore. And in the case of Bo Bardi it took him 5 years to sort of research all of this, and hopefully, in the book they will be making some of that research and that location and the photographs and the deep entanglement with her writing and her thinking and her form of display will come through, because yes, they are deeply felt.
I think that is quite a poignant place to end the idea of deep empathy and how that fits into the way that we think about museums, collections, collectors in the past and in the future. So all that leaves me to say is that once again, if you'd like to come and see the exhibition at Yale, it's on through December 10th. And thank you so much to Giuliana and Thom for what has been an incredibly enriching and productive conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.